attack to your mental state and everything else, because on a court they're going to ask you about your sexual history and everything else, which is usually something people don't necessarily like to talk about. But thirdly, you're usually offered a multi-million-dollar settlement, which is to say very hard to deny at that point. That is to say, in the status quo, this usually does not go to court. So what multi-million-dollar companies, such as, for example, Fox News, do in the status quo is go for multi-million-dollar cash settlements, which they give to the victims of these situations. That is to say, for example, when Bill O'Reilly sexually harasses the victims who work there like multiple times, they always end up doing the same thing, giving them money compensation in cash settlements to these victims. Why do they do this? Because they know they have the insurance money. This is very expensive, and this usually costs the company a lot. But when it's covered by the insurance, they don't necessarily feel this on their skin, right? That is to say that they literally give money to these people, to these victims, through insurance money, which then leads to literally silencing the victims to not saying what happened in this particular situation. That is to say, whenever there is a settlement going on, there is usually a clause in a contract which you sign that you have to be silenced about what happened, that you're not going to talk about this, that you're not going to talk about what happened, how it happened, etc. That is to say, whenever they have this opportunity, they use it to pay multi-million-dollar cash settlements, hence make people silence and everything else. They do this because they know that they don't have the risk, they don't feel the risk on their skin. That is to say that you don't necessarily have to explain to your board of directors why you didn't fire that person who did all of those things, because the board of directors doesn't necessarily feel like this is something that literally harms them in terms of the cash, because it's not their cash, it's the insurance company's cash in this situation. What is the outcome of this? That is to say that you have people who like multiple times harass people at a workplace, but still stay at this workplace, right? Because they're not perceived as a threat to the company, because they don't necessarily lose the company's money. They're not perceived as someone who is likely going to take away a lot of the cash or the scrutiny, because the scrutiny doesn't exist, because people don't know about these things, because they're told to be silent and everything else, because they have signed a contract to be silent on their side of the house, right? So what do we think changes? So what is the comparative? We think firstly that companies have less money for settlements. Notice, even though we're talking about companies that are really rich and have a lot of money, these are multi-million-dollar cash settlements, which is to say a lot of them don't have the money, or it just becomes too expensive to give settlements even if they have the money. So at the end of the day, sometimes it might be even better for these companies on our side of the house to actually go to these courts, because at the end of the day, it's less risky and it just costs you less on a net, right? That is to say that they can't silence the victims who have suffered on their workplaces anymore. Why is this important? Because this means that more people go to the court. Obviously, we can't prove that they're going to win at the court. Usually they're not, because companies have great lawyers or whatever, but that is not even important in this debate. What's important is that when things go to court, people get to know about these things, right? That is to say, you get information of what happened, of how it happened, of when it happened, who does these things and everything else. You understand that these things exist in these companies. Hence, there's much more scrutiny for the companies to change these things structurally, because usually at the status quo, structurally changing the way you work as a company is expensive. But if the scrutiny and the money that you're going to have to pay is so large, we think that then you have an incentive as a company to actually change something, because when it goes public, the scrutiny is generally so big that it just generally costs you more to not solve these things in the first place. Secondly, we think that you have more incentive to fire people that have done harassment, right? Because notice, in the status quo, when somebody is a CEO, CFO, or a very popular person like Bill O'Reilly or whatever, or in your company, you're important for this company, so they don't fire you because they don't perceive you as a threat. But when it becomes too much of a threat in terms of A, the money that they're going to have to pay, but secondly, court proceedings, legal proceedings, and the scrutiny that happens over your company because you're going to the court, because people are talking about what happens literally in your company, we think that you can't prove to your board directors that keeping a person is a valuable asset in your company, that they should still have their job. We think that at the end of the day, this leads to these people being fired for their positions, which is like principally very important, because we don't want them keeping their jobs. But secondly, it's also important because we think that this literally means you have less of these things in a workplace, right? When you see that they cost you too much and the scrutiny is just too big around these people, we think that then you have an incentive to fire these people. Before I go on, CEO, go guys. I like you very much.
One question, if your problem is with settlements being not public, why don't you ban the publicity or not being published those settlements? You just ban them being
because there are other things that surround all of those things, right? We can't just ban settlements, right? Because this money is not only about settlements necessarily. It's the money you give to these people so you can keep them silenced and everything else, right? We think that when this goes public and scrutiny is just too big, you're likely to fire these people. On a comparative, we think that people don't know about these things, which is less information about what is happening in these companies, and no pressure to fire these people or to change anything in a comparative. We also think that companies now have more incentive to work on their HR trainings, to focus more on serious problems that are structural and that happen in these companies, unlike in the status quo when they have almost zero incentive to do these things, because they know that somebody else is literally going to pay for these things and for them to keep these people on board and for these things to happen more. So on a comparative, on our side of the house, what you get is a structural change within these companies. You get more information what's happening there. You get these people fired, which at the end of the day leads to less harassment. We think that the status quo is very coercive towards the victims because it offers them so much money, and hence we want to change it this way. Please vote opening government.
Okay, cool. Thank you for that speech, Leader of Opposition.
Can everyone hear me? Perfect. 1 second. Panel, 4 things from opening opposition in this debate. Firstly, on a principle and why it's these people's right to take out this insurance. Secondly, on the insurance price, depending on your risk and therefore preventing risky behavior in the first place. Thirdly, on how more proceedings are taken to court on our side of the house. And lastly, on victims and how they benefit even with settlements. Before that, some framing, because I think OG is a bit unrealistic in how they framed us. I think one, this is obviously about both companies and individuals taking out this insurance, and it's mainly to cover the cost of legal proceedings. Like, yes, they could pay out the sort of payout payments in some instances, but as the CA has clarified, I think many insurance companies have like an incentive either not to include this or are just like, yeah, I think this is the most realistic scenario is that this is about civil legal, like the cost of civil legal proceedings. Crucially, this doesn't mean that these people are not criminally liable, right? It's just about the costs of the court proceedings, and those are taken over by the insurance. Secondly, then, why are these, who are the kind of people who would take out this insurance? Firstly, we think it's often part of the larger insurance package for legal proceedings. So things like, in general, you defend yourself or protect yourself against future legal proceedings, and it's part of that. I think in many cases, it's going to be companies taking this insurance out for their employees. And it's important to recognize that we're not just talking about the big $1 million companies that OG wants to talk about. Companies exist on a scale. I think this is incredibly important for small businesses and organizations like NGOs that often don't have the money to physically deal with these kind of cases. Okay, firstly then, on a principle, 2 things here. One, we think insurance, like taking out any kind of insurance, is just part of your principle of choice, right? You give up your money in exchange for that insurance, you have worked for that money is an extension of yourself. HUJI needs to specifically justify why that restriction on choice is justified. Secondly, though, we think it's not justified because it limits in many cases your right to a fair trial. We think the right to a free and fair trial is super important, right? If someone's inability to pay, to be able to purchase insurance would impede their right to defend themselves in a court trial, which could potentially jail them for life, we think this is incredibly unfair. We think in many instances, especially if we're talking about small businesses or individuals, this is likely that this would drive them bankrupt, right? Not everyone is a millionaire who'd be able to afford this. Secondly, though, we think just everyone should be able to afford representation and have the right to do so. I think judges will still decide whether they're liable. This is about making sure that they can actually defend themselves well. Secondly, then, on why insurance prices depend on risk and therefore limit risky behavior. And this directly clashes with a lot of what HUJI tells you. Firstly, we think insurance companies have an incentive to deny risky individuals, right? So people who, for example, have a rape record or were convicted of rape in the past are unlikely to get this kind of insurance. It's similar to how healthcare works in a lot of instances. Like in the US, for example, if you're an incredibly risky individual, then this would probably not apply to you. We think HUJI's claim of therefore people using this to repeatedly do wrong and to repeatedly commit sexual assault is just incredibly unlikely. Like even if this information isn't public, it means that your insurance will still know about it. We think that's important. Secondly, though, we think companies still have an incentive to prevent sexual misconduct in their businesses. And that is because if there is a claim and if your insurance company has to pay out for you, this often increases your premium. So one, there's like an active financial incentive for these companies still to prevent sexual assault, right? It's not like this is going to create like the Wild West or anything. I think this directly engages with HUJI as well, because it means that it's very unlikely that like companies allow abusive behavior to happen. But secondly, like reputational context still exists, right? It's not just like companies want assault cases to be associated with their company. I think HUJI is unrealistic when they say that this will lead to more risky behavior. Next then, on why more proceedings are taken to court on our side of the house, again, directly clashes with HUJI. What HUJI tells you is that, oh, companies and accused people are more powerful and therefore they can often bully the accuser. I think that's probably true on either side of the house. The key thing is therefore how the incentives of the people that are involved in these proceedings change. We think on government, it makes it less likely that people who commit sexual misconduct would allow the trial to take place in the first place. So what does this look like? One, we think that the cost of, or why is this the case? We think one, the cost of coverage would be very high, right? And damaging in a lot of instances. Even for a big company, this is incredibly harmful. We think the cost of trials are often higher than the payout in the first place, more uncertain, and the trial could just drag on forever, right? They don't have as much control as they would have over settlements. Secondly, we think employment contracts are likely to change. So at the point at which a company can no longer protect itself from these kind of things, it's more likely to have things like non-disclosure agreements to make sure that people don't speak out in the first place. Thirdly, we think there's likely to be threatening or violent behavior, especially if these people are so powerful, like HUJI wants to characterize them as, to force someone not to come forward. What do we prefer? We prefer a world where people are able to choose their trials if they want to, and where companies actively have the incentive to make sure that this actually goes to court because they're protected against it. They probably, like if this is an individual within their company that they dislike, they probably, or like that they are aware has committed sexual misconduct, they probably have more incentives that are aligned with yours compared to when this could ruin them. Why is this so incredibly important? Firstly, we think victims don't just want money, they want justice, and they get this more when proceedings are actually taken to court. This is the most important thing because we make sure that victims are protected. It also just means that there's more likely that that these people get convicted in the first place. But secondly, on OO's like benefit of like taking them to court and this means that HUJI's benefit of taking them to court is incredibly unrealistic. Before I move on, I'll take closing if you have something.
Given that the incentive is to get justice, isn't the fact that the company isn't actually going to pay out mean that many of the victims aren't going to come forward on your side?
No, I don't think that's true. I think victims are just more likely to be intimidated at the point at which the company risks like having to pay for this. I think it's very likely that they often have to. Okay, talking about settlements then. Firstly, on false accusations, I think these are likely to happen when the accuser knows that the accused will not be able to afford a full trial. This means it's more likely that you get out-of-court settlements for unjust accusations. I think this is a harm in and of itself. But secondly, on true accusations, I think it means you often on proposition will get forced into these settlements because court proceedings are more expensive and risky. Lastly, on NGOs, and I think this is an incredibly important group within this debate because often they get this kind of insurance because they send their people abroad into like risky environments where there's a high risk of accusation. For them, this is incredibly important to be able to survive. This is incredibly important for them not to have claims against them. But lastly, let's talk about victims. And this takes opening government at their best and assumes that like payout fees will be paid by these insurances in a lot of instances. I think this probably usually means that these victims get more money, right? Because in many cases, a person or a small business will go bankrupt and won't be able to pay out the same kind of fee that that kind of insurance contract would. On a comparative, they're able to afford that insurance because the premium is likely to be low, especially if they're low risk. So I think in those instances, it's likely that the victims get more money, that they get more compensation. I think for all of those reasons, you should vote opening opposition.
Thank you for that speech, Deputy Prime Minister.
Give me just a sec to get my headphones. Okay. 3, 2, 1. When Roger Ailes can sexually harass people, including Megyn Kelly, at Fox News for years, this is happening exclusively because that company and that board in that company knows that this person isn't a huge liability for the company because the multi-million cash settlement is highly likely to happen. NDA disclosure agreements are likely to happen, which means that no one outside of the company knows what is actually going on. I say this is very perverse incentive, which comes very often because of this insurance, right? Treating freedom of speech. Firstly, I'm gonna deal with their attacks in our case. I'm gonna deal with all of their material, and finally, I'm gonna engage in a trade because I do believe that in this debate there is a trade that we should consider. First of all, what are their attacks in our case? First attack we hear in a PI coming from SIA, but why won't we just ban settlements, right? I do believe that still victims should have a choice to some extent, right? We do believe that on our side, the choice is much fairer because you have an option to take the money, but we do believe that for a lot of like victims, this money is actually not going to be enough, and now they're actually going to feel empowered to go to court, right? Because no one can basically give you like a couple of millions to basically stop you from talking. I do believe this is a benefit on our side. Second thing that OO points out, but this is mostly about like civil legal proceeding. As George pointed out, it's actually not, right. Majority of like misconduct claims actually ends up being settled. No one knows about it. So I do believe that's a fair interpretation and like context of this debate that we should have, right? Third point, they say very often you will want like lower premia and like you want to like avoid like PR stunt. So there is an incentive for companies to like innovate and to actually take care of this like sexual misconduct. And as George pointed out, very often victims sign NDA agreements, which means that after you get the money, right? Basically, no one knows that something like this happened, which means that very often there is no pressure and you need to do this, right? And I do believe this is something which is incredibly important. And secondly, well, as Georgie pointed out also, there is no incentive in the status quo to actually take all sexual misconducts claim very seriously, right? And to actually deal with like the misogyny, exactly because even if something bad comes of it, right? Companies and like people at the top know that the risk is not taken up on them, right? The risk is taken on the insurance company, right? And I do believe it's something which is very important. Their case is the following, and I do believe it has like 3 parts, right? A, it has a principle. We shouldn't limit your right to a fair trial because of lack of money. This principle has nothing to do with this debate, right? A, if you're a small company or a small NGO, right, very often you don't have the money for this type of insurance, right? Very often premiums on these type of like insurance are very high, right? And I do believe that smaller companies or like people with not that much wealth, right, are not taking this insurance and they're out of this debate, right? But it's fine to bankrupt if you lose a sexual misconduct case, right? We're completely fine with that. If you have sexually assaulted someone and went to court and have bankrupted because of that, and because you didn't have this insurance, we're completely fine with that. I don't see how that's in any way principally illegitimate, right? Second thing of all that I point out is, but like if you're risky, this is not applying for you, right? Because very often insurance are just like not gonna give you the coverage, or like the premium is gonna be like too high. As we are like pointing out, very often companies are taking up this, right? Very often not for individuals, but very often in bundle for all of their employees, right? Which means that very often they are able to like negotiate to get like a lower premium, even if some people at that firm are very high risk, right? Because very often you're taking like the insurance for like all of your employees, which means that very often the insurance companies know that not all of them are gonna like commit sexual contact, right? Which means that very often the premium that you get is kind of lower, even if maybe you have one or two highly risky individuals who actually do this, right? I do believe this kind of takes their point away. They say like threatening of people is far more likely to happen, like NDAs are far more likely to happen. As I do believe it's like reasonable to assume, there are laws which are basically mandating how each company internally should deal with the sexual harassment assault, right? And I do believe that if you're not taken seriously, if you're threatened, right, you can go and basically, or to the press, or very often to the police, or to any other authority, and basically say that this is the thing which is happening, right? And I do believe this is something which is possible to do, and probably will happen to some extent, right? I don't see why this is gonna be that of a terrible issue. But now let's engage like in the trade-off, right? Because there is a trade-off in this debate. It probably means that at some point people are gonna get like lower cash settlement money, right? Which means that some victims are going to get like lower money. We believe this is fine, because if we can prove, and I do believe that Georgia points out that a lot of these people who are very often at the top are going to be fired now, it probably means that we have like less victims in the future, right? Because very often they are not going to be present at the workplace, and we should prioritize people who are future victims and who have not yet encountered the harm, right? And I do believe they have never rebutted the mechanism that Georgia points out, right? Why the board of directors and why the top of the company is far more likely to scrutinize these people, because it perceives them as a much higher risk to the company, and actually as a financial risk to the company, right? So if they're fired, that means you have less victims in the future, and we think we should prioritize this. But before I go into like second Wayne, I would like to take CEO.
Yes, so when you settle a case, it's because before there's been a lawsuit, which is both criminal and civil. Why do you say that there won't be public consequences when there is necessary a civil lawsuit and a criminal lawsuit?
But if you have a cash settlement, very often you give the cash settlement to the victim exactly because that's the way to ensure that they will not talk, right? They will not go to the legal proceedings. So very often cash settlements are just you cannot have them very often together with like the court proceedings, right? Because very often this is the reason the companies are giving you money, right? Second thing of all, we do believe that far more victims are now likely to actually go to court, right? Because the amount of money that you're going to get is simply going to be lower, which means that some of the victims, I'm not saying all, but probably Meghan Kelly, who still has money, who still has some power and fame, would be far more likely to actually go to court, right? Because now the money that she's getting is not that huge, which means that the risk calculation in her head is changing, which means that we're far more likely to actually know about like more cases, etc. On a comparative, as you point out, high position people in the firm are far more likely to be fired. Very often, you're far more likely to take like sexual harassment, like atmosphere, like more seriously, and to strictly punish your employees for this, right? And treated court proceedings are far more likely, which means that we're far more likely to know what actually is going on in this firm. Very proud to propose.
Okay, thank you for that speech. Before we go to the next speech, Deputy Leader of Opposition, can you just confirm in the chat whether you are happy to be streamed or not? Okay, cool. Thank you for confirming. Okay, with that, we can move on. So I call upon the Deputy Leader of Opposition. Here.
Okay, can everyone hear me and see me? The most important thing that you should care about in this debate is whether victims on our side of the house can A, when they enter settlements, get higher payouts, and B, can actually take somebody to court and be able to not have to engage in threatening or violent behavior for them to not be able to complete that trial. I'm going to explain what all of that means. But firstly, I'm going to do some points of clarity and clarification. Two things here. The first thing to note is that businesses exist on a range. OG just wants to talk about the biggest businesses. We think in the vast majority of instances, a lot of businesses have these kinds of insurance policies. Why is this true? Because I just think that in the vast majority of instances, even if you're a small to medium range firm and you want to protect your employees against some sort of misconduct claims, especially when you can't keep a tab on everybody, you're very likely to seek this kind of insurance policy. In a lot of countries, it's even like a compulsory thing to do. So with that said, that's important to note that just firstly, businesses exist on a range. They can't just talk about the biggest companies. Secondly, what do we support on opening opposition? The first thing that we support is the choice to opt into settlements when you want to opt into settlements. And the second thing is to opt into trials when you want to opt into trials. What we don't support on our side is to increase incentives to force people not to engage in court cases on their side of the house. So what do we think is likely on both sides? I think on both sides, it's probably true that there are incentives to settle in either way, right? You have your reputational incentives. It's far less costly to settle out of court because the court trial can be risky, it can be long, you have no idea, no control over how much money it's going to take, and you probably want to hide the fact that this thing has happened. Now, what is the delta here, and why is it such an important tipping point? What happens when you take away the insurance? We would say that from a financial perspective, for every single company across the spectrum, you significantly raise the costs of entering that trial to begin with, right? This is like, just consider that it's already unlikely that they want to take you to trial, and now you actually make it financially more costly for them to do so when they have to pay out of pocket. What do we think this is likely to do? Firstly, Louisa gives you a really, really important point about why we think that the actual entering into employment contracts will change, because we think that companies are going to force you to sign NDAs every time a sexual misconduct claim happens. That means that you make the workforce basically more hostile for every single person, especially women entering this field, at the point where companies have incentives to directly shut you down because they don't have the money to engage in a long and costly trial if that's what you choose, right? We think that that is extremely important and round winning in and of itself. Secondly, we think that they're more likely to force you into use convincing behavior to force you into out-of-court settlements. What does this look like? I think this probably looks like an asymmetry of power in these courtrooms where they tell you you're not going to get any more of this in the court trial, don't do it, blah, blah, blah. And victims are more likely to believe that in those situations because the company is likely to use more rhetoric or more convincing and persuasive language in order to force them out of these kinds of things because they don't have the money or they're too scared of that money to be able to actually go into a court trial. In court, but now let's say the victims reach court. What do we think is more likely to happen? First, we think that it's probably likely that on your side of the house, when they don't want the trial to go on forever because it could potentially bankrupt them or at least cause significant financial cost to them, and note that the reputation is now symmetric, we think that they're probably likely to enter plea deals and write out plea deals and actually get shorter sentences than otherwise, right? We think that if on both sides they're likely to be convicted of guilt, but now on your side they're probably more likely to enter plea deals because the risk of them going to jail is now lower than the financial cost of them actually being able to pursue this trial, means that they're probably going to get shorter sentences. Or secondly, they're probably going to harass you throughout the trial, aggressive questioning, make it far more traumatic for you to actually get to that trial to completion, which means that you're probably likely to stop that trial halfway through because the financial incentives, do you understand how expensive court proceedings are? You make it so much harder for victims to get justice on your side of the house when they go to court. That is the tipping point. That is the delta. That is why we're winning on it. Now let's talk about the three kinds of businesses in this situation. One, on big businesses. They say all brilliant, these businesses will change, blah, blah, blah. Couple of things to note here. The first thing is that they already have financial incentives to change because their premiums will rise, because even if nobody else knows, the insurance company who has to pay out for that thing will know, and then their premiums are likely to be extremely, extremely high if they do these things. Secondly, we think that at the point where you're actually engaging in getting that insurance company, the insurance company is doing a risk assessment of your company and saying, these are people that are risky individuals that have had harassment claims in the past, watch out for them. We think there's already incentives on that side of the house to change already. Secondly, we think there are already incentives to change for a number of reasons, right? Things like reputation. But if they aren't and like risking your reputation. But if there aren't incentives to change, we think that the kinds of incentives that exist not to change are symmetric as well. Things like socialization, things like I know the person that raped this woman, but because he's friends with me, I'm not going to rat him out. Those things don't change on either side of the house. But finally, we think that at worst for them, it actually gets far better on our side of the house when it's far worse on your side of the house when it's far less likely that these cases ever get to court, and when they do get to court, they're cut short because the reputational costs then don't ever come out, right? On our side of the house, at least if victims want to go to court and they are able to go to court because companies aren't menacing them to not do this, we think that's more likely that these things will get exposed, and then the financial costs on that in that situation will be higher and companies will actually change. Secondly, on small companies and NGOs, because all they say here is literally like, this is their response. They're just like, they never get insurance. No, because you're adjudicated by risk. Yes, it's expensive, but if you're not a risky company, you can still get the insurance. So why is this really, really important? Because firstly, the principle then stands. They can't just say this is just about people that have assaulted somebody. Even if you've assaulted somebody, you still have a right to a free and fair trial. You still have a right to tell your side of the story. You still have a right to get the sentence that you think is appropriate to the kind of crime you've committed. But secondly, I think it's possible that there are going to be false accusations at the point at which people know that they might bankrupt you with this trial. And I think in those instances, it's really important to protect people and ensure that they have that right. But secondly, in terms of NGOs, they just didn't want to engage at this point. And before I explain it again, I'm going to take a POI from closing. Opening? Okay. On NGOs, why is this important? I think it's really important that people that insurance claims against their employees because they're going out in so many places across the world and the potential for having a kind of claim might be quite high. It's important for them to know that they have insurance to cover that because their margins are already small. They're already non-profit companies. I actually think that in your side of the house, the worst case for you is far less of these missions actually happening at the point at which you can't control what your employees are doing. And if something does happen, you don't have the money to actually make sure that you can actually cover the cost of that trial. I think this is really, really important because it literally probably means that people aren't getting as many services from NGOs like food and basic things because you won't let them cover things that are probably out of their control in a lot of instances. But finally, why are victims the most important thing in this debate and why do we win on victims? Two pieces of weighing here. The first is I just think in out-of-court settlements, if they're happening on our side of the house, with insurance company payouts, the first offer is going to be far higher than it is on your side of the house. If you want victims to get money, they're getting way more money on our side of the house when the companies have more money to give them and they want to reduce the idea of them going to trial. The payouts are going to be far larger. Two, in and after court, they don't have the active incentives. They care more about their reputation than they care about the money in these instances. They're going to let the trial go on in order to save themselves. And that is when we will catch them with their reputation. We will be able to have that trial be completed to conclusion. For all of those reasons, vote OO.
Okay, thank you for that speech. Now to move the debate on to back half, I call upon the member of government.
Society puts laws in place because it wants to make sure that it can actually protect its citizens and protect the norms of society and protect the basic rights of its people. At the point where we are allowing people to effectively get away from paying the price that we think is the harm that they have caused, we are doing two things. One, we are depriving society of its basic right to protect the rights of the citizens and the rights of people. And two, we're just making it massively less likely that people are going to come out and complain and actually make sure that we are getting these cases out into the open. We think that both of these things are terrible. One of the first principally and the second practical. We're going to talk about these two things, but first of all, a little bit of this idea that now the companies are going to pressure the people even more into not complaining than they would otherwise. We have no idea what the delta is on this debate. If anyways the company doesn't want to have higher fees like they tell you for the insurance, and they don't want to have bad media, and they don't want to have bad reputation, and so on and so forth, probably they're doing everything within their powers already to stop the people from complaining. If it is, I don't know, more persuasive language that HUJI tells you, maybe some other worse things which they don't tell you, but we think that just the delta here is very, very slight if it exists at all, right? Then they tell us, look, these companies don't want do want to change because they don't want to have very high insurance fees. We think the thing is that, first of all, obviously you need to know that they're paying much less for the insurance than they would pay in the court. Otherwise, no sane company would take the insurance, right? The point of this insurance is that I am able overall to reduce my cost, at least for most people. If I think that I'm going to be paying massively more, this is not true. It is true that insurance has an incentive to raise the fees for someone who is risky, but it is also true that insurance has the incentive to not have very high fees that nobody wants to pay, and this is also. Now the thing is that it is very costly for a company to make the changes that it needs in order to actually solve its problems, but it is unlikely for the rise in insurance for most of the companies who don't, have these cases every single day to be so meaningful as to actually cause them to make these changes. Why are they very costly? Because we think that you need to have much better vetting, you need to have better vetting process for the candidate, you need to ask more about past references and what they've done in the past, you need to have more women and the diversity in the selection process, you need to create a culture that can prevent this, which means having more training, which means often removing the type of people who are ridiculing the training, even though they are people that are doing good to the company. It means that you have to take complaints seriously. You can't just move an employee to another department. You have to actually remove that employee. You need to investigate claims. You need to have someone who is in charge of actually listening to these complaints. We think that all of this takes massive resources from the company, and we just don't know from the analysis why it is true that the somewhat rise in fees once in a while is going to make the companies to do this. We think that when we have the fear of, I don't know, when they tell you like bankruptcy or having really, really bad things happen to your company, this is something that is much more likely to cause. So in terms of just this is going to bankrupt people because they can't afford the court itself and not because they have to pay up the reparation for something bad they did, which we think is a good reason to be bankrupt. We think that the thing is that first of all, there is public protection, and we don't know why that is not enough. They don't explain why this is not enough. We think that if this is the right, then we can provide it as a state. And we also think that probably these are cases that are hard to prove in court, and we don't know why it is so costly to have the legal fee. Let's talk about the purpose of this. I think the legal system is meant to make sure that society is able to set its norms and laws and is able to protect the most basic rights of its citizens, right? And especially protect it in the type of cases where the economic incentive is going to harm those most basic rights. We think that when we are setting reparations or fines that you have to pay for a specific crime, that is because we think this represents the amount of harm that you have done to society and to the victim by committing that crime. We think that at the point where we're saying we are allowing the companies a way to pay significantly less than what society thinks they owe according to this crime, we are effectively saying that there is a way for them to bypass the norms and laws that society has set out to create within its legal system. We think that this just massively harms the ability of society to protect these most basic rights of its citizens. And this is not something that is legitimate, and we think this is more important than the company's rights to protect themselves, right? Because we think that, first of all, we're talking about much more basic rights than economic rights when you're talking about bodily autonomy, mental and physical safety, the ability to, not have trauma, not have to deal with all the harrowing emotional experiences that people have to deal with, the ability to have really autonomy of your body and not feel that you are subjected to other people. But we also think that probably, because as we said that companies can invest the money and make a change, then it is very, as we said in the rebuttal, then it is very likely that the companies, most of them are not going to be harmed very much. So they have to pay more for making these changes, obviously, right? But we think that the harm to the individual's rights is probably much more massive in this case. Before we continue, POIs, anyone? I guess opening?
Yes, closing?
Sure, closing, yeah.
Yes, isn't this an argument to forbid any type of insurance in any type of matter because this logic applies exactly the same?
We think it's fine for companies to insure themselves against things that they have no control over. This is when we think insurance is fine. We think when they're insuring themselves against committing crimes and ruining people's lives, that is not fine. And if you have other cases where people insure themselves against ruining a person's life, then Yeah, that should not be something you can insure yourself against. Just don't ruin people's lives. Okay, let's talk about the incentives to complain, because we think that, look, most victims who complain don't do it for the profit, right? We think that there are many reasons not to complain. First of all, because the large risk associated. I don't know how this is going to play out and whether I will actually succeed in court. And also, I don't know if I'll get fired or have retribution and all of the things that HUJI seems to be speaking about. Right? We also think that you just find it is much more important to you psychologically to get over the hard experiences that you've been through. When you actually file a complaint, whether it's in the company or in a legal process, you are reliving terrible experiences. You need to describe them again and again. And probably you just want to try as well as you can. Obviously, you can't completely, but as well as you can to put it behind you, to forget it, not to have to constantly be dealing with the pain and with the suffering. Right? And we think that the thing is that when it, like I'll tell you, most companies are not huge companies that are going to pay trillions of dollars out in reparations. And that means that for most cases, probably the profit is not worth it for the people to take these risks and complain. What actually does get people to complain? We think that probably it is the fact that they think they can make a difference by complaining. Because we think that person who has suffered from this type of terrible things constantly has in their mind the fear that now that person is in a different department, but they're doing the same things. They are imagining in their minds how someone is suffering like they have suffered. What are the terrible experiences they're undergoing and how emotionally this is going to ruin other people. We think that just this is so haunting that this is what leads people to complain in most cases, even though there is a risk, because this is just something that makes them suffer so much, to have the idea that nothing is going to change. When they think the process is not going to change anything because there is just other ways to get around it, probably this isn't enough of an incentive to complain, and that means we get less complaints. For these reasons, please oppose.
Thank you for that speech, member of opposition.
Am I audible? Great. So I'll be starting in 3, 2, 1, go. We're going to win this debate by proving that victims are better off, more protected, and far better in our side. Let's deal with HUJI first. Basically, the core of their case, which is extraneous to our case, is that you harm the principle of fair retribution because people are not going to longer pay for what they do. I have 3 rebuttals here. First, it isn't clear why the insurance company is not going to pay the same amount of money to the victim who gets repaired in the same amount than before. Secondly, precisely by the logic she gave in the answer to my POI, i.e. it is fair to protect yourself against things you can't control, and i.e. business cannot control every of their businesses, it is also okay to insure this. But most importantly, even if we concede all of this part of the case, I mean, even if we concede that there's a harm to the principle of retribution and the aggressors are better off, we say to you that it is okay to concede this because the consequence is to protect the victims better off. And in that trade-off, we prefer aggressors to be a little better if that means, as we're going to prove to you, the victims are far better. And we think that principle is not in and of itself something you always preserve without any consequence. That's on the extraneous of HUJI. HUJI told to you something very interesting, which is settlements are bad because they lead to secrecy and less denouncings. The problem with this case is that the mechanisms are very flawed. I have 3 rebuttals that are missing from OO, which are very important. The first is that there is a false premise in the case of HUJI, which is that when you settle, when you go to this company, you don't go and denounce first. Indeed, many times you do go and put a criminal or civil case before setting, more if your counterparty is not your enterprise anymore. If you know that your counterparty in the negotiation is the person who is in the insurance company and you need to negotiate with the insurance company, it is more likely that before you start denouncing, you file the claim, you file the denounce because your leveraging power is even greater. So it is a false premise that you won't settle. Secondly, this argument, entirely the case, misses the premise that the victims have a hard proceeding which deters them to denounce either way. So as I'll prove in my substantive, this is so important, even if there's a little marginal more than us, many people won't do it because of the harsh of the proceedings. And lastly, as I told in my POI, if you are only concerned of the fact that they are secret, you can always ban them and just that. Let's go to the core of the case. The problem in all of the GOP case, especially in HUJI, is that they assume the fact that when you don't have settlements, people would be less deterred to do this, and hence there would be less victims and more denouncing. What we tell to you is that today, in nowadays society, there are already a lot of deterrents not to do sexual misconduct. Jail deterrent, like 10 years in jail if you do this. Risk of being fired if it is discovered that you do it. And it is stupid to presume that people that do these things don't get fired. They do, because the harm of the image to the company when you have someone who's sexually deterred is so massive. The power of the feminist movement appointing a company that points out that is a sexual harasser and it's not fired, it's massive. So consequently, people get fired. Personal image of someone who harasses is so exposed and so harmed forever that you already have deterrence. Logical corollary of all this is that people that do this are not going to get more deterred, less deterred, or anyhow deterred by the fact that some insurance company covers it. The consequence of this is that the premise, the nuclear premise of HUJI, that less conducts are going to be put in place because people are going to get fired or people are going to do less, is just wrong. This is not going to happen. Now, that being the case, we're going to prove to you that victims are better off in our side of the house. Why is this the case? Firstly, because there's more likelihood that the company supports the victims rather than the opposite, which was the status quo before. Note that before, companies' money was at stake. Money that is probably most important to their viability, that is important for them for whatever reason. So their company was at stake. The consequence is that the attitude that they needed to pose against that reclamation, that denouncing, was very harsh. They needed to go to the court. They needed to do as bad as possible to the victim. They went as shit as possible so that they don't lose the money. Now, they don't have the money at stake. What they have at stake, it's their image. It's people pointing them and saying, you didn't protect the victim. What now it's going to happen is that money is covered by the insurance company, but the company is going to protect the victims, it's going to support them, it's going to help them to denounce, it's going to put better channels to do it because of the fact that now they are protecting their image, which before was also damaged. So yes, maybe the aggressor, i.e. the company, gets a lot more protected, but the consequence is that he sweeps what the attitude was before, and now it's much more protected towards the victim because he wants to protect their image too. Logic how important this is for the debate. A, it flips the logic from HUJI, and it flips the fact that is less denounces. There will be more denounces because of the fact that in the long term, when you are a victim, you know that you have the power to denounce and the company will be you and not against you, will be supporting you and not the aggressor anymore because it will try to cover themselves. Secondly, the victim is better off because it gets paid. Look, HUJI told you some mechanisms why most companies couldn't pay many times. What they didn't tell you is how important it is for those victims to get paid. HUJI literally said the following: they are willing to trade off that victims get paid less because of some future victims that they didn't prove that they exist. But anyhow, what we tell you is that each of those victims, the money that they get, is so essential because, as CG told you, they can redo their lives. They walk away from the place where they were harassed. The cost of overcoming all of those harms is very high, and the fact that they have the money is so important for them. Hence, getting that money is very important for their life. But most importantly, as I told you, as there is a change in companies' minds, the fact that you don't have to face a criminal or civil litigation, which was very hard, is massively important. Note the fact that the consequence that the company had incentives not to pay was that they tried to elong the proceedings 5 to 7 years, that they made a private life scrutiny of yourself. They search into your emails during the past of your company. They ask your friends and colleagues if you did anything wrong. They go to your image, whether you were at a party, where you did X, Y, whether you drank, whether you smoked in the company. The fact that their incentives were not on protecting you, but on harming you, made those proceedings very hard. When people saw that, the company harassed them also in trial, they weren't up to denounce. Now they know they can denounce. Now they are freer because the company is not going to harass them in that proceeding. Hence, they're better off, they're paid, and they denounce more. Very proud to propose.
Thank you for that speech. Now to close the case to their side and the government case, government whip.
Starting in 3, 2, 1. Look, at the end of the day, the only way in which we actually get any change in our society is if we change the incentives that these companies have and ensure that they're actually going to be held accountable for the endemic culture that they create. We are the only ones who show you why we're going to do that, and that is what we're going to win. I'm going to talk to you about the principle, and then I'm going to talk to you about how we're actually changing that. Before that, let's deal with a couple of pieces. There's one main piece of rebuttal to the case that we got. They basically, what they come up and told us is, now the companies can just support you in your suit, and so for some reason that's going to be much better. We're not exactly sure why or what it is that support necessarily does, or to what extent that makes a difference. But even if we accept that as true, let's just understand a second what's on the line here, because this has been very confusing. If I am suing a specific employee at a specific company who has harmed me, then the company is not liable for that money. They may have bought insurance that will also cover that employee, and that's fine, and that's in the debate. But it is not the case that without this mechanism, for some reason, the company is going to have to pay out for my having sued a specific person who was at that company. We don't understand how this incentive changes. We think that when this is relevant, when they have to pay out, is when you're suing generally, crediting the company for creating that environment, for creating that culture, for doing these terrible things. In that situation, in that terms of that's where they have to pay out, then at that point, they can no longer just say, oh yes, we'll support the suit. We'll accept the fact that we created a terrible culture. We'll accept the fact that we allowed for sexual harassment to happen. We don't think that that is like the case, because at that point, that's still risking the image. But second of all, we just don't think that this image point is such, second of all, we think that admitting that many of your employees or any of your employees, suddenly if they're in any reasonably senior positions, have actually committed these acts is not a thing that you're going to want to do. And you're going to want to attempt to protect your employees on both sides of the house, and you're going to want to attempt to stop that image from getting out. But thirdly, we think that insofar as for most of these companies that we're talking about in the debate, image is not such a big deal, because if you are not like Fox or a multi-million-dollar company, but most of the average companies that exist in the world, no one knows or cares that the manager at my local supermarket may or may not have been sued for sexual harassment. This isn't the big thing that impacts the way that companies work. We think that what impacts them is their financial incentives, which is what we're going to talk about in a second. So then let's move on to talking about the principle here, because opening governments don't provide you with one. Nobody else doesn't tell them why do people have the right to protect themselves, etc., etc. Netta is the one who gets up and tells you, look, it is not the case that you have the right to protect yourself against paying out for what the society has said is your punishment. We would not allow people to insure themselves against going to prison, no matter how much money they paid in advance. You don't get to avoid the punishment that we have decided as a society you have to pay, and people have the right to demand of you, right? Well, now, what did we get in response to this? Opening government tried to tell us this is a question about the opening opposition. This is a question of the right to fair trial, right? Because you need to be able to pay for your lawyers or things along those lines. One, we just think that if that is a basic right, then you should be paying for people's lawyers anyway, and that's something that should exist regardless of the question of them having paid insurance. That's not protecting people's basic rights. Second of all, we just don't think this is the likely scenario of a bunch of nuisance lawsuits of sexual harassment. These are exactly the kind of things that get thrown out in advance of court when there is because there's very little evidence of them. It's very difficult to fabricate or put into place. We don't think this is the likely scenario where it's like a bunch of NGOs are suddenly going to get shut down, or there's a bunch of false claims being made. We think that it is incredibly difficult to do. This is not the way in which people use those nuisance lawsuits. Closing opposition tried to tell us, well, either way they're paying the victims the same. We say that's fine that you're paying the victims the same. That's irrelevant to the question of you having to go through your punishment and create the incentives that society has decided is necessary for you to make changes and to pay the punishment you deserve for you to make changes. That is not the same thing. But secondly, they tried to tell us, well, if we don't have any way of protecting ourselves anyway, and if you can't control it, then it's legitimate for you to take out insurance. This is exactly what Netta tells you in her rebuttal, and I'm going to go into this a little bit more, that you can protect yourself, that you have things that you should be doing as a company to try and create that culture, to ensure that you're not having these kinds of employees there, to ensure that you're not opening yourself up to a liability and up to a lawsuit, and that you haven't done that in that situation. So let's talk about what those things are. Actually, before I do that, let's take a POI from opening. Go for it.
Every time you take out an insurance, you literally have a risk investigation done, which means that people are flagged far earlier, and you have the incentive to remove them because of high premiums and reputation. You never engage with how that solves the root cause.
Cool. Okay, cool. We're engaging with that in a minute. I'm not going to do it directly in this POI. Great. So let's talk, therefore, in terms of therefore, we've set up this principal case that tells you that it is not legitimate for you to not pay out what society has forced you to pay out, and not to be to avoid your punishment. But let's talk about why it is that we actually protect ourselves from these problems, right? OG tried to their mechanism for change is to say, look, certain big companies have massive reputations to protect, and now they don't have to do that because they just get people to sign NDAs, and so they no longer have an incentive to change anything. And if the CEO of the company does it, then they're not going to want to fire them or anything like that. We're going to give you a much likelier claim that doesn't apply only to these biggest multi-billion-dollar companies about how it is that we're creating their incentives to change in a second. But opening opposition tried to tell you that, look, what happens is both opening and closing you, try to tell you that you get way less people going to court because the companies no longer have it, like now the companies have an extra incentive to harass or to put NDAs against them or to stop this from going to court. We think one, Net already tells you we're not sure what the difference in the incentives here is, but two, the specific mechanisms that opening opposition talk about in terms of like active harassment or NDAs that people like signing that don't allow you to go to court or whatever are illegal under the status quo, and suddenly if they're not, they should be, and that we can protect people from this kind of active harassment regulation. We don't understand what the difference is in terms of those incentives of those companies. But we give you a much more likely mechanism of change. Two things here. One, what we tell you is that we need to create a big enough financial incentives. Unlike opening government, we don't just think that you don't want to fire big CEOs. We think that creating a culture that avoids sexual harassment is massively expensive. We think that it requires a massive vetting process. It requires putting women in positions of power that you maybe don't necessarily think at this point in time deserve to be there in order to protect people and have women that they can go to. It means actively taking seriously small claims and little jokes that people are making that create this environment where people don't feel comfortable coming forward, and firing or seriously sanctioning workers who you otherwise think are good for relatively minor breaches that cost you a lot, but that you need to do in order to protect them. It means having a lot of human resources actively investigate and look into every aspect of this. We think these things are incredibly expensive, and the only way that it makes it worthwhile for you to do this is to actually have a big enough cost. Obviously, insurance is some kind of cost, and obviously the rise in premiums is some kind of cost, but there's a much bigger cost associated with the fact of actually having to pay out in a lawsuit. And the second you're risking this, then not just the big multi-billion-dollar companies, but every company, it changes their incentive and changes the way in which they do this. But more than that, in terms of that mechanism change, it changes the likelihood of people coming forward, because Meta tells you that one of the biggest reasons that people come forward a lot of the times is not for themselves, because it's not worth it for them to go through this trauma again for the money, because they don't know that they're going to get the money, because it's very, very risky and dangerous and upsetting, and many, many people are unwilling to do so. But when they think that they can protect people, they do. Today, they don't think that they're going to be able to protect people because they know that the company isn't going to have to pay out. They know that the people who are responsible for this aren't going to have to pay for their crimes. They're not going to be damaged. The company doesn't have a massive incentive to change. Even if their premiums rise a little bit, that's not what's going to make a massive difference. And at that point, that means that way, way, way less victims are coming forward, because it's not worth it for them if they don't think they're actually going to get the change and be able to protect the other and future victims. This means that any mechanism of change that requires people to actually complain gets much, much greater on our side when they have the belief that this happens. This is much more important than some people getting a few more dollars on a settlement. Please oppose.
Thank you for that speech. Now to close the case for their side and indeed the debate as a whole, opposition whip.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, I will start in 3, 2, 1. Let's start with closing government strenuous rebuttal and then go to the classes. Let's start with the rebuttals to closing government to our case. First rebuttal they do to our case is very weird. They say that the companies are not liable, therefore the insurance doesn't matter at all. I have two rebuttals to this. First of all, for the whole debate has been assumed that they are liable. That's why OG gave so many examples about that. And it's like civil subsidiary liable after the aggressor. But secondly, and more important, even if not assumed, obviously he is liable. If not, why is going the company to buy an insurance? If they are not risking anything, why to pay a premium every day, every month, if they are not liable? Obviously, they are liable. Second rebuttal to our case is that the is not very important to the companies. We think that this is key for our case, so I'm going to give 5 rebuttals for this. Main rebuttal is that it's very important for this because in all the companies, the important is the competence. And if they have competence, the clients can go to another company and therefore buy their own products. That's materialized in several ways. For example, every scandal that happens in the press affects to the stock markets. For the directors of the company, that your stock market goes down is very, very bad thing. And every scandal goes down for that. Secondly, probably decrease the sales because people don't want to buy you anymore. Thirdly, there are public contracts made by the state that are not capable of doing deals with companies that have this kind of standards because very unpopular for the electorate. Fourthly, there are Twitter campaigns against this company, like they mark you in Twitter and makes you Me Too campaigns against you. And 5, even more important, as they talk, they are very important also the small businesses. When you are small businesses and you get market because you have the stigma of being a rusher, the people of the neighborhood no longer buy the fruit in that shop because your wife say don't go there. This is a place where they mistreated women. So I think that the image obviously is very important for them. Third point of rebuttal to CG. They talk about aggressors and they say that this is unfair because they don't pay. I have here 4 rebuttals. One is already done by Antonio, which is that probably went to be fired anyway because of the risk of image. Even if it's like a secret settle, you are not going to risk of a new that say, hey, this company not only permit harassment, but later maintain these people. It's like a risk that you don't want to take. You probably will fire. Secondly, because of principles, it's probably that the company react anyway. Most people hate aggressors. Most people don't want a woman to be harassed, but therefore they will take measures anyway. Maybe they have a small delta in their case, but I think that the main delta is that people don't want aggressors in their company. People don't want women to be harassed, therefore they will go against them. And third rebuttal is that probably they will still be held liable because, as Antonio told you, criminal cases cannot be settled. This is very important. Criminal cases cannot be settled. Therefore, the criminal cases will continue in most of the cases. Now, two classes in this debate, past victims and then the victims of the future. First of all, past victims. Past victims are clearly considered by opening government, in which is a huge concession to the cases of opposition. They say that they will have an easy settlement, that they will take the money, and that they will not have to go under years of investigation in their personal life, of emotional devastating process, etc., etc. We think that this is a massive concession because all victims of the past are in our side of the house. All victims of the past are better in our side of the house. They can rebuild their life, as Antonio told you, with the money. They can run away from the aggressors and not be forced to work inside the same company in which the aggressor are for the years that the court dealing the jurors. Do you think this is extremely important? I will go now for future victims, but if only we win this case, this is very important. Government never explained to you why the victim has to sacrifice for future victims, why the people that have suffered the most, which has their life ruined, has to sacrifice even more in order to protect future victims. I think that we have all these people which already suffer and we have to protect them. Only with this class, we think that we are doing very good in this debate. Second class is why the victims in the future will be worse. And this is almost exclusively point for Antonio. First is because of the previous class. If victims know that they are going to have a very bad time if they go and denounce, they are going to denounce less. Therefore, the argument of closing government that the people is not going to hold accountable is flipped, because if people don't denounce because they are afraid, there will be less accountability. I think that even if the settle is secret and they don't pay, just to speak up and the company knows, oh, this guy is an aggressor, it's more likely that they act, even if this aggressor don't go to jail, than if nobody knows it at all. Second rebuttal, and this is very important, Antonio told you, I'm going to try to explain it in English because it's very important. We think that now it's much more likely that you first denounce and then try to negotiate and not the other way around. And therefore the settlements will not be a secret. Why is that the case? Before this, we don't want to denounce first, because once I denounce, the damage to the image to the company is so hard that they are going to fight me in the court until the end. Meanwhile, now in the court, I will be fighting the insurance company, which don't care about the image in this case because they are not the ones which harass you. Therefore, you can have both benefits. You can first denounce in criminal and civil cases, and only then I go and sit down and settle with the insurance company, because the insurance company is going to settle even if I have denounced first, because the only thing that they care about is money. Therefore, they will denounce even after I am in court. Therefore, the settlement will be more public in our side of the house. This is unique analysis by Antonio, and it's very important because it crushes most of the cases of government. Before I continue, I go with the point to HUJI.
People are far more likely to be fired now because they're seen as a big financial risk for the company. And future victims are far more important because the harm has not yet occurred to them and we can stop them.
I already explained, most of the people are going to be fired anyway because of the damage to the image. Secondly, because you don't want to have harassed people in your company. Third point is how, as Antonio explained to you, how now the company is going to help you in the negotiations and also in the court against the insurance company, because sometimes it will go to court. Not all the cases will be settled, and in those cases, company will be in your side because they want to clean their image. They are not having money invested in any way. Therefore, they have incentives to help you. Okay, final comparative here. Let's say that they are right, I don't think so, but that the bad guys are a little bit less liable. I think that they are going to be a lot liable, first of all, because the settlements are going to be public, as I said, and secondly, because of the criminal court continuously, but let's say they are a little bit less liable. We put in our balance that the victims of the past are clearly considered for them are better on the side of the house, and secondly, that because of that, because the victims are going to be better on the side of the house, future victims will speak up more. And in speaking up more, they will have more money for speaking, they will have better lives, and therefore they will be better. Even if we have to trade that bad guys are a little bit more, they're going to be fired anyway, but a little bit more. I prefer all the victims, which are the ones which suffer, which are the core of this debate, to be better. We think we have the victims on our side, especially past victims, but also future victims. We don't care if the aggressors don't help a lot, so liable. We are victims are more important, so we are very proud to oppose.
Cool. Thank you to all speakers for an excellent debate. And good luck to all teams. Bye.
Thank you so much, judges. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Okay, cool. Judges, take a minute, and if you can take a minute or two, and then we'll do teams you think are definitely in, teams you think you're definitely out, if you have them. And we're still, as I can see, recording live. Can we cut the recording?